Two fighter jets disappeared from radar at 0347 hours. No distress beacon, no visual confirmation, just silence. And then a single desperate voice crackling through the emergency frequency. "We need call sign Phantom, right now." Every air traffic controller in the region froze. Every specialist in the building went pale. And in the trauma bay of Redwood Memorial Medical Center in Silver Ridge, Colorado, a middle-aged nurse in worn-out scrubs looked up from a chart. Her hands went still. Her face, usually careful, usually blank, shifted into something no one in that hospital had ever seen before. Dr. Paulson Graves sneered from across the room. "Stay out of this. You're just a nurse." She didn't answer him. She didn't have to, because she already knew who Phantom was. She was Phantom. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to my channel right now and follow every part to the end. I promise you won't see what's coming. Like this video, and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night shift at Redwood Memorial started the way it always did. Badly. Evelyn Hart clocked in at 11:45, 14 minutes before her shift officially began, because that was what she did. Not because anyone asked, not because anyone noticed. She arrived early because the overnight transition between the ER nursing teams was always a disaster. Medications misfiled, IV bags running dry, patients left in the dark about what was happening to them. Someone had to catch it before the chaos compounded. That someone was always her. She moved through the corridor quickly, exchanging 2 words with the departing nurse. "Bed 4?" and receiving a tight shake of the head in response. Bed 4 had been a 73-year-old with a pacemaker complication. He'd been deteriorating since 9. The outgoing team hadn't flagged it in the handover notes, which meant either they hadn't noticed or they'd decided it wasn't their problem anymore. Evelyn changed course immediately, cutting left toward the cardiac monitoring station. "Excuse me." A hand came up in front of her. Dr. Paulson Graves, first-year resident, 26 years old, still wearing the expression of a man who believed the universe owed him something. "The nursing station is that way. Patient assessment is my job." "I know where the nursing station is," Evelyn said. "I've worked here 11 years. "Then you know your lane." She looked at him for a moment, just a moment, then walked around him without another word and went to check on bed 4 herself. The patient, a retired electrician named Doyle Marchetti, was awake and frightened and had been lying there for 20 minutes with an alarm light blinking on his monitor that nobody had responded to. His lips were dry, his hands were cold. Evelyn checked his vitals, adjusted his position, and had a medication consult request filed within 4 minutes. Graves appeared in the doorway as she finished. He looked at the chart, looked at her, said nothing, and left. That was most nights. Silver Ridge was a small city by Colorado standards. Wide streets, cold winters, and a hospital that had been expanding for 15 years without ever quite figuring out what it wanted to be. Redwood Memorial had started as a regional trauma center. Somewhere along the way, it had accumulated a cardiology wing, a pediatric floor, a research partnership with a university 3 hours south, and a reputation for aggressive billing. What it had not accumulated in any meaningful way was institutional humility. The administration was a layered machine. At the top sat Medical Director Harlan Doss, who had been in that office for 9 years and treated it like a private domain. Beneath him, department chiefs, clinical supervisors, a revolving door of young attending physicians who understood quickly that advancement at Redwood Memorial depended on alignment. You agreed with Doss. You backed his initiatives. You kept your head down when the quarterly reports were shaped into something more flattering than accurate. The nursing staff knew all of this and mostly worked around it. They weren't naive. They understood the structure. What they couldn't quite articulate, and what nobody had ever sat down and officially said out loud, was that certain people in the building had become functionally invisible. Not overlooked by accident, invisible by design. Because invisible people didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Evelyn Hart was one of those people. She was 51 years old, brown-haired with significant gray at the temples, medium height, medium build, the kind of woman who moved through a room without drawing attention and preferred it that way. Her patient outcomes were consistently excellent. Her documentation was meticulous. She never called in sick, never left a shift early, and had accumulated more continuing education credits than anyone in the nursing department. None of this had ever been formally recognized. What Redwood Memorial knew about her: she had a nursing license from Colorado, 11 years of tenure, a quiet demeanor, and a home address in the foothills outside town. She drove a 12-year-old truck. She ate lunch alone. What Redwood Memorial did not know, what the employment file deliberately did not contain, was everything before. At 2:17 in the morning, the emergency radio frequency used by the hospital's disaster coordination office crackled to life. It shouldn't have. That channel was reserved for mass casualty events, infrastructure failures, scenarios requiring coordinated response across multiple agencies. It had gone off twice in 11 years, once during a wildfire and once during a gas main explosion that took out 4 blocks of the commercial district. The staff who remembered those incidents described the sound of that frequency as physically distinct, a quality to the static that made your stomach drop before you'd even process the words. Evelyn was in the supply corridor when she heard it. She stopped moving. The voice on the channel was controlled but edged with something underneath the control. Not panic, but its close neighbor. "This is Falcon Station, emergency coordination, to all regional medical facilities. We have a military aviation incident. 2 aircraft. 2 crew members. 1 confirmed critical. We are requesting immediate trauma preparation and specialty personnel notification. All facilities respond." She was already moving back toward the ER before the message finished. The nursing station was in transition. 3 people on their phones, 1 consulting a reference database, none of them moving with any particular urgency. Graves was at the physician workstation with 2 other residents, the 3 of them clustering around something on a monitor that apparently held their full attention. "Did anyone hear the coordination frequency?" Evelyn asked. Silence. "Military aviation incident," she said. 2 aircraft down, 1 critical crew member incoming. Graves turned around slowly, in the way people do when they want to communicate that they're being interrupted. "We have a trauma surgeon on call. This isn't your concern." "Dr. Renata Marsh is the surgeon on call," one of the other nurses said carefully. "She's in a procedure." "Then someone needs to pull her out." Evelyn was already at the phone. "And whoever runs the OR prep team needs to be activated." "You don't activate the OR prep team," Graves said. "A physician does that." "Then find one and tell them to do it in the next 3 minutes." She dialed the on-call supervisor while Graves stared at her. He was working through the calculation, whether to escalate, whether to back down, whether the situation was serious enough to override his instinct to reestablish hierarchy. He was still working through it when the second transmission came through. This one was different. The voice was not the measured tones of a regional coordinator. This voice was military, clipped, and precise, and it carried the particular weight of someone who was used to being obeyed immediately. "Redwood Memorial, this is Air Rescue Unit 7, Sierra. We are 11 minutes out with a critical patient, male aviation trauma, advanced interventional support required. Be advised, we will also need confirmation of available personnel. Specifically, we are looking for a medical operator with the call sign Phantom. Repeat, we need call sign Phantom. Please advise." The supply corridor went quiet enough that Evelyn could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. She was standing with the phone in her hand. The on-call supervisor had picked up and was saying something, but Evelyn had stopped processing the words. Her eyes had gone to a specific point in the middle distance, not unfocused, but fixed on something no one else in the room could see. Call sign Phantom. The on-call supervisor's voice came through again, louder. "Hart, are you there?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was level. "Activate the major trauma protocol. Contact Dr. Marsh and pull her out of the procedure if you have to. Get OR2 prepped." She paused. "And someone needs to answer that radio." She set down the phone and walked directly to the trauma coordinator's station where the radio sat. Around her, 3 nurses and 2 residents were watching her with varying degrees of confusion and alarm. Graves stepped in front of her. "You are a floor nurse. You don't respond to that channel." "I know," she said. "Then back up." She looked at him. Not through him, not past him, at him directly, in a way that made him shift his weight slightly without quite understanding why. Then she said very quietly, "Move." Something in her tone was different enough that he did. The 11 minutes felt shorter than they should have. Evelyn spent them doing the things that needed doing, not the things that were officially her job, and not the things anyone had asked her to do. She prepped the crash cart. She identified the two trauma bays with the best monitoring capability and confirmed the equipment was functional. She found the staff who were actually awake and competent and positioned them where they would be useful. Graves watched all of this from a distance, trying to determine whether he should intervene. He kept not doing it. Dr. Renata Marsh arrived in the ER at 2:31, still gowned from her procedure, pulling off her outer gloves with efficient irritation. She was 44, sharp, and had no patience for the kind of territorial posturing that consumed most of the hospital's energy. She took one look at the prepared trauma bay, at the staff in position, and said to no one in particular, "Who set this up?" "Hart," one of the nurses said. Marsh nodded once and kept moving. The air rescue unit arrived at 2:38. Evelyn heard the vehicles before she saw them. 2 military transport units and a support vehicle pulling into the emergency bay with the kind of coordinated precision that came from years of doing exactly this. The bay doors opened and the team came through fast. 8 personnel in tactical gear surrounding a gurney carrying a man who was hooked to 3 different monitoring systems simultaneously. The lead figure came through the doors last. He was perhaps 50, heavy across the shoulders, and he moved with the unhurried speed of someone who had spent decades learning that panic cost you more than it bought. His rank insignia identified him as Lieutenant Colonel. His name tape read Ashford. He swept the room in 2 seconds. "Who's in charge of this facility's response?" Graves stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Graves, emergency medicine." "Where's your trauma attending?" "On her way." Ashford processed this and kept moving. He was looking at something else, scanning faces. "We put out a request through the emergency channel. Personnel identifier, call sign Phantom. Has anyone confirmed?" Graves frowned. "That's not a designation we have on record for any—" "It wouldn't be on your record," Ashford said, without unkindness but with absolute finality. He was still scanning the room. "It's a classified tactical identifier. We sent it because we have a reason to believe this individual may be in proximity." Military records confirmed a residential registration in Silver Ridge 18 months ago. "I don't know who you're talking about," Graves said. Ashford looked at him for a moment, then looked past him. Evelyn was standing at the edge of the trauma bay. She hadn't moved toward the group. She hadn't said anything. She was watching the patient on the gurney, reading the monitors, tracking the breathing pattern, noting the specific position of the rescue team's own medic, and the way his hands were moving over the IV line. Ashford saw her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the resolution of a question. He walked toward her. The team members with him tracked the movement, adjusting without being told. When he stopped in front of Evelyn Hart, he was standing straight, and his voice had changed in a way that didn't immediately register with the ER staff around them. "Are you Evelyn Hart?" he asked. "Yes." "Call sign Phantom, 22 to 29, Tactical Aviation Medicine, 73rd Combat Wing." She held his gaze. "That's a classified designation." "I have clearance to confirm it." He paused. "Do you?" The question was technical, formal, and underneath it was something else entirely, something like relief. Yes, she said. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and permanently rearranged the understanding of everyone present. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford, United States Air Force, stood at attention. His hand came up in a crisp practice salute, not a gesture, not a formality, but a deliberate and unambiguous act of military recognition directed at a woman in worn hospital scrubs with a laminated nursing badge clipped to her left pocket. The 2 military medics flanking him did the same. The ER staff did not move. Graves had gone the color of old wax. Evelyn looked at the salute for a moment. Then she said, "At ease." It came out automatically, without inflection. "Tell me what we're working with." His name was Captain Darian Wohl, 31, test pilot, Air Force Experimental Aviation Program. The aircraft he'd been flying had experienced a catastrophic structural failure at altitude, not enemy fire, not pilot error, but a material failure in the airframe itself that had triggered an emergency ejection sequence. The ejection had saved his life. The landing had complicated everything else. He had a hemopneumothorax on the right side, air and blood both in the chest cavity, along with a suspected splenic laceration, a fractured left femur, and a traumatic brain injury of undetermined severity. His blood pressure was unstable. His O2 saturation was dropping. Ashford relayed all of this in 45 seconds, organized and precise. His medic provided the full field intervention log, what they'd done in transit, what they'd held off on, what they were uncertain about. Dr. Marsh arrived as the handoff completed. She assessed the patient in real time, absorbing the information with the practiced efficiency of someone who had run hundreds of these. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Talk to me," she said. "Not an order. A request from one competent person to another." "The chest needs to go first," Evelyn said. "Pressure's too unstable for a full workup before we address the hemothorax. If the spleen is actively bleeding, we've got maybe 10–12 minutes of workable window before it cascades." She paused. "He also took a significant impact to the right side of his neck during ejection. I'd want imaging before any intubation attempt. There may be cervical involvement." Marsh was already moving. "Agreed. Get me the chest tray and call radiology for portable cervical series, and somebody page vascular." "On it," said one of the nurses. Graves had not moved from where he was standing. He was watching Evelyn Hart instruct the trauma team, not tentatively, not as suggestions, but as the organized analysis of someone who had done this before in conditions no civilian hospital could replicate. And he appeared to be experiencing a fundamental recalibration of something he had believed was settled. Ashford stepped up beside him. "How long has she worked here?" the colonel asked. 11 years, Graves said. His voice had lost its texture. Ashford nodded slowly. 11 years, he repeated, mostly to himself. Then, "And you had no idea." It wasn't a question, and he didn't wait for an answer. The next 90 minutes were the kind of sustained, focused work that looked chaotic from the outside and felt, from the inside, like moving inside a very precise machine. Marsh led the surgical interventions. The trauma team executed. The military medics integrated with a smoothness that spoke to their training. These were people who could operate inside an unfamiliar facility without losing tempo. Evelyn stayed in the room. Nobody officially told her to. Nobody had given her the role she was performing, which was somewhere between clinical coordinator and tactical advisor, tracking multiple systems simultaneously, flagging developing complications before they became emergencies, translating between the military medics' field protocols and the hospital's standard procedures when they diverged. Twice during the operation, she caught something that the primary team had nearly missed. The first was a developing arrhythmia on the cardiac monitor, a subtle pattern that looked within normal range on a cursory reading, but that she recognized as a precursor to something worse. The second was a medication interaction that would have complicated the anesthetic management. Both times she said something, quietly and directly, to the physician making the decision. Both times, she was right. Nobody commented on it in the moment. The room was moving too fast for commentary. It was only when the immediate crisis had stabilized, Wohl on the OR table with the hemothorax drained, his pressure holding, the surgical team confident in the trajectory, that Evelyn stepped back and the room seemed to exhale around her. Ashford had been watching from the observation area above the trauma bay. He came down now, moving through the corridor with two of his team behind him. He found Evelyn in the supply alcove off the main ER, restocking the crash cart with the methodical thoroughness she always brought to this particular task. Her hands were still. Her breathing was steady. She looked from 20 feet away exactly like what Redwood Memorial believed she was, an aging floor nurse doing post-incident cleanup. "Captain Hart," Ashford said. She didn't correct the rank. She also didn't look up immediately. She finished securing the medication tray, closed the cart drawer, and then turned. "It's just Evelyn now," she said. "That's your call." He studied her. "You know we didn't know where you were. When you left the program, the file was sealed. Nobody tracked you. That was the arrangement." "The arrangement," he said, and there was something in his tone that might have been respect and might have been something more complicated. "You spent 11 years in a place like this." She met his eyes. "People get sick here too." It was a simple statement. It carried more weight than the words themselves. Ashford was quiet for a moment. Then, "The pilot is going to make it. I'd put money on it." "Don't put money on anything until he's through the next 6 hours." "Fair enough." He glanced toward the ER, where two nurses were watching them from a careful distance. "There are going to be questions. My unit's presence here, your involvement. This doesn't stay contained." "I know." "You want to be ready for that?" She thought about it. Not about the question. The answer to that was already settled in a place that didn't require deliberation. She was thinking about the 11 years before this night, and about the night itself, and about what it had cost to maintain a particular kind of invisibility. "I've been ready," she said. "I just wasn't sure the right moment was going to come." In the main ER bay, Dr. Paulson Graves was standing at the nursing station, looking at the closed door to the supply corridor. His face had the expression of someone who had discovered, mid-sentence, that the floor was not where he thought it was. The radio on the trauma coordinator's desk crackled once. Then a different voice, higher authority, different channel, came through. "This is Inspector General's office. Redwood Memorial contact required. We are en route. ETA 45 minutes. Do not clear the facility." Graves looked at the radio. Then he looked at the two nurses beside him. Then he looked back at the door where Evelyn Hart had gone. The night, it turned out, was nowhere close to over. The 45 minutes the Inspector General's office had quoted turned out to be 32. Nobody in the ER was ready for that, which was probably the point. Evelyn heard the vehicles before she saw them. Not the organized precision of the air rescue unit's arrival, but something sharper, more institutional. Two dark sedans and a government-plated SUV pulled into the emergency bay in the kind of formation that communicated, without any words, that the people inside them were not accustomed to waiting. She was still in the supply alcove when the bay doors opened the second time that night, and she could hear the shift in the building's atmosphere, the way you could sometimes hear a weather change before it arrived, a pressure difference, a held breath moving through the corridors. She finished what she was doing. She capped the last medication drawer on the crash cart, noted it in the supply log, and then walked out. The man leading the Inspector General's team was named Garrison Price. I was perhaps 55, built lean, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that stillness read as authority. He wore a gray suit that had been expensive once and was still well maintained. His credentials, which he produced and held open for Evelyn to see when she appeared in the corridor, identified him as a senior investigator with the Department of Defense IG Office, Aviation and Medical Operations Division. She looked at the credentials without touching them. "You made good time." "We were already in the region," he said, which was not an explanation of anything. He looked at her with the same calibrating attention Ashford had, but different in quality. Ashford's had been recognition, Price's was assessment. "Your heart." "Yes." "We need a private space and we need it now." He glanced at the ER around them. 2 residents, 4 nurses, and Graves, who was standing near the physician station with the specific body language of a man trying to appear uninvolved, were all either directly watching or performing a version of not watching. "Not here." "Conference room 2 is open," Evelyn said, 30 feet down that hall. He nodded and moved, his team following without instruction. Evelyn followed them. She did not invite Graves. He came anyway, which she had expected. Conference room 2 was used for department budget meetings and the occasional training session. It had a long table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with last month's nursing coverage schedule, still half visible under an incomplete erasure, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look mildly unwell. Price's team, 3 investigators, one of them carrying a hard case that she recognized as a field documentation unit, arranged themselves efficiently. Ashford was already inside when they arrived, which told Evelyn that Price and Ashford had spoken before any of them had reached the hospital. Graves walked in behind her and sat down before anyone invited him to. Price looked at him. "You are?" "Dr. Paulson Graves, Emergency Medicine." "Are you the attending physician of record for this incident?" A pause. "Dr. Marsh is the trauma attending." "Then I'll need her in here. You can wait outside." Graves didn't move immediately. It was only a second, but it was a visible second. Then he stood and left, pulling the door behind him, with the controlled care of someone managing an emotion they didn't want observed. Price sat down. His lead investigator opened the documentation unit, a compact system that began recording as soon as it was powered on. Nobody announced it. Nobody asked permission. Evelyn noticed the small red light and said nothing. "Ms. Hart," Price began. "It's still Captain," Ashford said from his position against the wall. His voice was even. "Technically, she's still commissioned. The separation was administrative hold, not discharge." Price absorbed this without visible reaction. "Captain Hart, walk me through tonight from your end." She did. She was precise and sequential and did not editorialize. She described what she had heard on the emergency frequency. The actions she had taken to prepare the trauma bay, the clinical interventions, the specific decisions she had made, and on what basis. She spoke for approximately 8 minutes without being interrupted, which was unusual in her experience of official conversations. When she finished, Price was quiet for a moment. "You made clinical decisions that fell outside your license scope," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact being placed on the table for examination. "I offered clinical analysis," she said. "The licensed physicians made the decisions." "Dr. Marsh can confirm that?" "Ask her." He nodded slowly. Then, "How long have you been at this facility?" 11 years. "And in that time, have you at any point disclosed your background to administration? Your military service record, your tactical medicine training, your rank?" She held his gaze. "My service record is classified. My separation agreement included a non-disclosure component. I complied with that agreement." "That's not what I asked." "No," she said. "I never disclosed it voluntarily." There was a silence that occupied the room differently than the previous ones. Price's investigator was writing something. Ashford was looking at the ceiling. "Why not?" Price asked. She thought about the honest answer to that question. There were several versions of it, some cleaner than others. She chose the one that was most accurate. "Because I didn't want to. I came here to do the job that was in front of me. My history wasn't relevant to that. Tonight it was. Tonight was different." "Tonight," Price said carefully, "is what brought us here. But I want to be clear with you, Captain. My office isn't here only because of tonight." She waited. He opened a folder that his investigator slid across the table. "We've had an open inquiry into this facility for 7 months. Billing irregularities, incident report manipulation, and a pattern of personnel action that correlates with a specific cluster of events. Your name appeared in that inquiry 6 weeks ago, not as a subject, as a person of interest who might have information." "About what?" "About the incident involving a patient named Doyle Marchetti, 73, pacemaker complication, last November." The name landed in her chest like something dropped from a height. She kept her expression level. "I remember him. He filed a complaint through the state medical board 4 months ago, alleged that his deterioration was identified by a nurse on the overnight shift, you, and that when you escalated the concern, it was overridden. He subsequently experienced a cardiac event that his cardiologist believes was preventable. He survived, but he lost functional capacity he won't recover." "I know," Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet. "I was there when he came back in. His complaint named you as the nurse who had tried to escalate. He wanted to thank you on record. The board forwarded the statement to our office because the escalation you made that night was documented as rejected by the duty physician, and that physician was Dr. Paulson Graves." The fluorescent light hummed in the ceiling. Outside the conference room, the ER continued its machinery of the night shift. "I see," Evelyn said. "The documentation shows Graves overrode your concern. His notation on the incident report reads," Price looked at the page, "Nursing staff intervention declined. Clinical judgment not warranted." He looked up. "You filed no counter documentation." "I knew it wouldn't go anywhere." "That's exactly the kind of thing I need you to tell me more about." Dr. Renata Marsh came in 20 minutes later, still in surgical scrubs, her hair flat against her head from the OR cap. She sat down across from Price and answered his questions with the direct economy of someone who had given testimony before and understood that brevity served everyone better than elaboration. Yes, she had arrived to find the trauma bay prepared beyond standard protocol. Yes, the preparation had been done by Evelyn Hart. Yes, the clinical observations Hart had offered during the trauma response had been accurate and acted upon. No, she had not questioned Hart's basis for those observations at the time because the observations were correct and the situation did not allow for credential review. "In your assessment," Price said, "did Ms. Hart perform at the level of a floor nurse tonight?" Marsh looked at him steadily. "No." "What level?" "Trauma coordinator at minimum, possibly higher. She caught things I might have caught 3 minutes later." She paused. 3 minutes matters. Price made a note. Marsh glanced at Evelyn before she left. It was a brief look, uncomplicated, and it carried something in it that 11 years of hospital hierarchy had never quite managed to transmit. The simple acknowledgement of one competent person by another. The inquiry in conference room 2 continued for another hour. At some point during that hour, word reached the ER floor that the IG investigators were in the building, and the particular alertness this produced, the stiffening of postures, the sudden interest in documentation, the quiet conversations that stopped when certain people walked past, told Evelyn things about the facility's culture that she already knew and that were now, apparently, going on record. Harlan Doss arrived at 4:47 in the morning. He came in his car, not in his administrative clothes. He was in civilian dress, a coat thrown over what looked like clothing he'd put on in a hurry, and the fact that someone had called him at home and he had come in anyway, at this hour, indicated that whoever had made that call had communicated a sufficient level of alarm. Evelyn saw him cross the lobby from the ER corridor. He didn't see her. Doss was 61, broad through the middle, with a gray beard he kept trimmed to a particular length that he seemed to believe communicated thoughtfulness. He had been at Redwood Memorial for 9 years, long enough to have built the place in his own image in the ways that mattered and some that didn't. He ran his department chiefs the way certain men ran things, with the distribution of access and the withholding of it, with the low-grade understanding that disagreement had costs that agreement did not. He went directly to conference room 2 and knocked, without waiting for an answer. Price opened the door, assessed him in 2 seconds, and said, "Dr. Doss, we were going to come find you. Come in." The door closed. Evelyn leaned against the wall across from the conference room and breathed. The corridor was quiet at this hour. A single orderly moving a supply cart somewhere around the corner, the distant sound of a monitor alarming and then being silenced. She was tired in the specific way that came from sustained alertness, the kind of tired that wasn't about sleep, but about the concentration it took to remain present and functional when every circuit was running hot. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it counted. She thought about Doyle Marchetti's face the second time he'd come into the ER. Diminished, slower, one side of his expression not quite tracking with the other. She thought about the look he'd given her when he recognized her. Not blame. Something more complicated than blame. She pushed away from the wall and went back to work. There were still patients. There were always patients. A 16-year-old with a compound fracture from a night skiing accident who was terrified and trying not to show it. An elderly woman with a UTI that had developed into something systemic and required careful monitoring. A man in his 40s who had driven himself to the ER at 3 in the morning with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal but had needed proper evaluation before anyone could say so with confidence. Evelyn moved between them. She explained things clearly and without condescension. She adjusted the teenager's pain management when she saw the chart wasn't reflecting his actual level of distress, not by changing the order herself, but by going directly to the covering physician and laying it out plainly until the order was changed. The covering physician, a third-year resident named Dr. Voss, who was not Graves and who operated without the territorial scaffolding, changed it without argument. She was checking the elderly woman's vitals at 5:30 when she heard voices rising in the corridor. Not the controlled tension of official conversation, something with an edge of desperation in it. She stepped out. Graves was in the hallway outside the conference room. The door was open behind him, which meant he'd either been inside or had just been sent out. His face was doing something complicated. The careful composure he usually maintained was present, but being actively maintained, which was different from coming naturally. He saw Evelyn and the composure cracked slightly at the edges. "They're pulling the incident logs," he said. She waited. "All of them, November through current. They want the duty physician records for every overnight shift." I was keeping his voice low, but only just. "Do you know what's in those logs, Hart?" "I have a general idea," she said. "They're going to take everything out of context. That Marchetti case, I made the right call based on the information available to me at the time." She looked at him steadily. "Doyle Marchetti lost the use of his left hand. He can't drive anymore. That outcome wasn't predictable from the data I told you," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I sat at that nursing station and I told you specifically that his rhythm was showing pre-event indicators. I told you what I was seeing. You documented it as nursing interference and sent me back to the medication cart." His jaw tightened. "You're a nurse. You don't diagnose." "I flagged a concern," she said. "That's my job. Evaluating it was yours. The question investigators are going to ask is whether you evaluated it or dismissed it. Those are different things. He didn't answer that. He turned away and walked down the corridor too quickly, in the manner of someone who needed distance from a conversation before it extracted something further from them. Evelyn stood in the hallway for a moment. She was not satisfied. She was not triumphant. She felt something that didn't have a clean name, the particular exhaustion that came from being right about something you'd wished you were wrong about. She went back to her patients. At 6:12 in the morning, one of Price's investigators, a younger woman named Sabine Okafor, who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped narrating it, came to find Evelyn in the ER. "Captain Hart," she fell into step beside her. "We've been going through the personnel files, yours specifically. All right? There's a notation in your file from approximately 8 months ago, performance review, initiated by Dr. Doss's office. The language in it is," she paused, choosing words carefully, "unusual. It characterizes your clinical interventions as unauthorized overreach and your interactions with physicians as disruptive to department hierarchy." Evelyn had read that review. She'd read it twice, alone, in the employee bathroom, and then folded it and put it in her bag and taken it home and sat with it for a while before deciding what it meant and what she was going to do about it. "I saw it," she said. "Did you respond to it?" "I was told the response period had expired before I was notified the review existed." Okafor stopped walking. "You weren't notified in the standard window?" "I received it 3 weeks after it was filed. The notification was addressed to my former home address." She looked at the investigator. "I moved 14 months ago. HR had my current address on file." Okafor's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it shifted. "Do you have documentation of your current address submission?" "I have the form I submitted. It's at home." "We'll need a copy." "I'll get it." They stood for a moment in the corridor. Through the window at the end of the hall, the Colorado sky was beginning to separate itself from the night. Not light yet, but less dark. The particular pre-dawn gray that promised a change that hadn't quite arrived. "There's something else," Okafor said. Her voice had lowered, not conspiratorially, but carefully. "The pilot you helped stabilize tonight, Captain Wohl. His aircraft carried experimental avionics that are the subject of a separate classified investigation. The structural failure was not random. There's a procurement record discrepancy that traces back to a civilian contractor with connections to 2 board members of this hospital." Evelyn processed that. "That's a significant thing to be telling me." "It's a significant thing to have happened in your building." Okafor looked at her. "I'm telling you because the scope of tonight is larger than one nurse and one angry administrator, and because you're going to be called as a witness in at least 3 separate inquiries, and I'd rather you understand the shape of the thing you're stepping into." "What shape is that?" "It goes up," Okafor said simply, "and it goes sideways further than anyone expected." She handed Evelyn a card. "You have my direct number. Don't talk to facility administration about the specifics of what we discussed tonight. That includes Dr. Doss." She walked away. Evelyn held the card for a moment. The shift change was beginning, the day staff arriving, the overnight staff logging out, the building recalibrating toward morning. Around her, people who had slept and eaten and lived ordinary hours were pulling on badges and checking schedules, carrying coffee cups, exchanging the social shorthand of a workplace beginning its day. None of them knew what the night had been. She put the card in her pocket and was about to turn back toward the patient wing when the door to the stairwell opened behind her and Harlan Doss walked out. He looked, for the first time in her memory, like a man who was not in control of his environment. His coat was rumpled. The deliberate calm he carried as a professional instrument had developed a fracture somewhere. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes moved across the corridor before settling on her. He had found her specifically. She understood that immediately. "I need to speak with you," he said. She turned to face him. "I'm on shift." "This takes precedence." "A lot of things are taking precedence tonight," she said. "Most of them involve federal investigators." His expression compressed. "What have you told them?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 11 years of early shifts and ignored escalations and performance reviews sent to wrong addresses. She thought about Doyle Marchetti's left hand. She thought about a supply corridor and the steady work of restocking a crash cart that she had kept doing, Because the work was real and the patients were real, and none of the institutional machinery around her changed that fundamental fact. "I told them the truth," she said. His face did something she hadn't quite expected. Not anger, that she would have understood. Something closer to the expression people made when they realized, too late, that the ground they had been standing on was not solid. He opened his mouth. The door at the end of the corridor banged open. Okafor's colleague, one of the senior investigators, a tall man named Reyes who had been in the conference room all night, walked toward them with the focused movement of someone arriving at a predetermined destination. "Dr. Doss," he said, and his voice carried the formal weight of what was about to follow. "We need you back in conference room 2. We have additional documentation we'd like you to review." He paused at a distance of 3 feet, which was close enough to be deliberate. "It's not optional." Doss looked at Evelyn one more time. She had nothing left to say to him. She had said everything that needed saying to the people who needed to hear it. He walked away with Reyes, and as they turned the corner toward the conference room, Evelyn heard Reyes say something in a lower voice. Specific, procedural, the language of a process that had formally begun. And the door at the end of the corridor opened and closed, and they were gone. She stood in the quiet hallway for a moment. Her feet ached. She had been on shift for over 6 hours, and the morning was barely started. From the patient wing came the sound of a call button, insistent, rhythmic, the kind that meant someone had been waiting. She turned and walked toward it. Behind her, somewhere in the building, she heard a door lock with the soft, definitive click of something being sealed. And in conference room 2, Garrison Price opened a second folder, one that had not been on the table before, one that had been couriered to the facility in a sealed diplomatic envelope while Evelyn was in the hall. And he spread its contents across the table in front of Harlan Doss and watched the medical director's face go completely still. The documents inside were not from the Inspector General's office. They were from the Department of Defense, Classified Division, and they bore a date from 7 years ago, and a signature that matched the name of a board member who had approved the procurement contract now under investigation. And at the bottom of the first page, in the margin, in handwriting that had been there since the document was originally filed and never removed because no one had ever expected it to be found, was a notation in red ink that cross-referenced the approval back to a financial instrument, a payment structure, routed through a shell entity registered in 2 states. One of those states was Colorado. Price looked at Doss across the table, and he waited. Doss didn't speak for a long time. The folder sat open in front of him, and he looked at it the way people looked at things they had convinced themselves would never surface. Not with guilt exactly, but with the particular expression of a man recalculating everything he had believed was safely buried. Price let the silence run. He had learned a long time ago that silence in rooms like this did more work than questions. It was the board member's signature that broke Doss finally. Not the payment structure, not the shell entity, not the procurement cross-reference. The signature. Because the board member whose name was on that document was a man named Clifford Alt, and Clifford Alt had been sitting on the Redwood Memorial Board for 6 years, and Harlan Doss had lunch with him on the second Tuesday of every month at a restaurant in downtown Silver Ridge, where they always ordered the same things and talked about the facility's expansion plans and the quarterly projections, and never, in 6 years of those lunches, had Doss asked where the money in the endowment fund actually came from. "I want a lawyer," Doss said. "That's your right," Price said. "We're not charging you with anything at this time. We're asking you to review documentation." "I want a lawyer before I review anything else." Price closed the folder. "Then we'll wait." He looked at his investigator across the table. "Get him a phone." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot where the morning was arriving in the gray, incremental way it did at altitude, slow, cold, indifferent to what was happening inside the building. Behind him, Doss was dialing with hands that were not entirely steady. Price thought about Evelyn Hart. He had read her file before coming here, not the Redwood Memorial file, which was thin and carefully maintained and said nothing of consequence, but the other file, the one that required his clearance level to access, and that he had read twice on the flight out from Washington. The file described a career that most people who worked in military medicine would not have believed possible for a single individual. Tactical aviation medicine instructor, emergency recovery specialist, the architect of a field triage protocol that had been quietly adopted by 3 branches of the armed services, and that bore no name because the person who created it had separated from service before anyone had gotten around to the paperwork of attribution. 17 years of work compressed into a document that was itself a fraction of what she had actually done, because the rest of it was classified at a level that even Price's clearance didn't fully open. And then she had come here, to this hospital in this small Colorado city, and spent 11 years doing overnight nursing shifts and restocking crash carts, and being told by 26-year-old residents to stay in her lane. He didn't know if that was strength or grief or some combination that didn't have a word. He suspected it was something more complicated than either. In the ICU on the 3rd floor, Captain Darian Wohl was alive. He was not comfortable. He was not stable in the way that meant safe. He was stable in the way that meant the immediate catastrophic possibilities had been managed, and the remaining risks were serious but no longer instant. The hemothorax had been drained successfully. The splenic laceration had been addressed in surgery. The femur fracture was immobilized. The TBI remained the variable that nobody was willing to call resolved, because TBI at that level of impact didn't resolve quickly. And the imaging had shown 2 areas of concern that the neurology consult had characterized as watchable, in a tone that communicated they required more than watching. He had regained consciousness briefly at 5:40 in the morning. The attending nurse had noted it. He had said 2 words, not to the nurse, not to the military medic who was maintaining bedside presence per Ashford's instruction, but apparently to no one in the room, and then had gone under again. The 2 words were, "Tell Phantom." The nurse had not known what to do with that. She had documented it and moved on. Ashford was in the ICU corridor when Evelyn came up to check on the post-op status at 6:45. She wasn't supposed to be on this floor. Her assignment was the ER. But nobody had told her not to be here, and the mechanisms by which people like Graves or Doss would normally redirect her appeared to be otherwise occupied. Ashford saw her coming and straightened. "He's holding," he said before she asked. "I saw the chart update. The TBI presentation concerns me. His unit's neurosurgeon is flying in from Lackland. Lands in 3 hours. That's good." She looked through the ICU window at the form in the bed. The monitors, the lines, the specific stillness of a sedated patient that was different from sleep in ways that were difficult to articulate, but immediately apparent to anyone who had spent time in these rooms. He said something this morning, when he came up. "Tell Phantom," Ashford said. "Yeah, I know." "What does he want to tell me?" Ashford was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the same window she was. "Wohl flew with your program, not directly. He came up after your time, but he trained under instructors you trained. The protocol he was using for the emergency ejection sequence, the decision tree, the order of operations, that was built on your framework. His program director told him who built it." He paused. "He's known for about 2 years that the person who wrote the procedures that saved his life was out here somewhere, working civilian medicine." She absorbed that. "He requested the assignment," Ashford said. "The experimental flight program in this region. He requested it specifically." She turned to look at him. "He was trying to find me." "He was trying to find Phantom." Ashford met her eyes. "Same thing, apparently." She looked back at the window. The monitor above Wohl's bed was tracing a rhythm, imperfect, variable, working hard. "He's 29 years older than the version of me that built that framework," she said. "I'm not sure he found what he was looking for." "Maybe he found something more useful," Ashford said. She didn't answer that. She looked at the chart clipped to the ICU board, cross-checked 2 notations that she wanted to verify, and then turned and went back down the stairs toward the ER and her patients and the work that was still in front of her. By 7:30, the day shift had fully arrived, and with it the particular social recalibration that happens in institutions when something significant has occurred overnight. But not everyone knows yet what it was. The ER day staff could read the room, the presence of federal vehicles in the parking lot, the closed conference room, the military personnel still occupying portions of the facility, Graves in the corner of the physician station with the expression of a man who had eaten something wrong. And they filled in the gaps with speculation. Some of it was close. Most of it wasn't. Evelyn was at the nursing station completing her end-of-shift documentation when Price's investigator, Okafor, appeared beside her for the second time. "We need you in a formal interview," she said. "Not now. This afternoon, if possible. 2 o'clock. I'll be here." Bring whatever documentation you have about the performance review and the address notification issue. Anything else that establishes a pattern of, she chose her word, administrative interference. I have some things at home. Do you want a courier? Evelyn looked at her. I'll drive. Okafor nodded. She started to go, then turned back. One more thing. The documents Price showed Doss this morning, the procurement records. Doss's lawyer is going to push back that his client had no knowledge of the financial structure. That may be true, but it doesn't matter, because the investigation isn't going to stop at Doss. Alt, Evelyn said, and at least 2 others on the board. The payment routing went through a contractor that supplied components, specifically the avionics system that failed on Wool's aircraft. The failure wasn't random mechanical. The component was substituted, a cheaper part with a shorter tolerance, approved by someone who knew it wasn't equivalent and signed the certification anyway. She paused. Wool didn't crash because of bad luck. He was flying a plane that was going to fail. The only question was when. Evelyn was very still. Who signed the certification? That's still being confirmed, but the contractor's board of advisors includes 2 names you'd recognize from this facility's administration. The nursing station hummed around them. Phones, monitors, the ambient noise of a hospital morning. Evelyn set down her pen. That pilot is 29 years old, she said. Yes. And someone approved a compromised component to save money on a contract, and they signed their name to it. That's what the documentation indicates. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not anger exactly, and not grief, but something that incorporated both of them and then went further into territory that didn't have a clean label. The particular response of someone who had spent 17 years learning that aviation safety was not abstract, that the distance between a functioning component and a failing one was measured in human lives, and who was now looking at the specific human life that had almost been ended by exactly that distance. I'll be at the 2 o'clock interview, she said. I'll bring everything I have. She went home at 8:15, drove the 12 miles to the Foothills property in the kind of morning silence that felt different from night silence, wider, more exposed. The house was small and orderly, the kind of order that came not from compulsion, but from a long habit of clarity, of knowing where things were because, in the environment she had come from, knowing where things were could be the difference between a good outcome and a terrible one. She found the HR notification form in a file drawer the one she had submitted 14 months ago with her current address, dated and stamped by the Employee Services Office. She found the performance review, the copy she had taken home, and the formal response she had drafted in the weeks after receiving it. A response she had never submitted because the window had formally closed before she was notified and because she had understood clearly what the timing meant. She found 3 years of nursing logs she had kept on her own, outside the hospital's system, because she had understood also clearly that the hospital system was not neutral storage. She made coffee that she didn't drink, stood at the kitchen window looking at the hills while the coffee went cold, and then packed everything into a flat folder and drove back to Silver Ridge. She arrived at Redwood Memorial at 1:40. The government vehicles were still in the lot. A second wave of official vehicles had joined them. 2 she didn't recognize, one bearing state medical board markings. The lobby had the charged atmosphere of an institution in the middle of something it hadn't expected and couldn't fully control. Evelyn crossed it without stopping and went straight to the elevator. She was on the 2nd floor, heading toward the conference area, when she heard Graves's voice coming from around the corridor bend. He was talking to someone, another physician, she thought by the register, and his voice had the rapid, slightly elevated quality of someone trying to construct a position in real time. I documented everything correctly. The escalation protocol was followed. If Hart is saying otherwise, she needs to produce the actual records because my notation clearly states. She came around the corner. He stopped. The other physician, Dr. Voss, the resident from the overnight shift, looked between them and found somewhere else to be with a speed that suggested he had excellent instincts. Graves and Evelyn stood in the empty corridor. They're looking at the Marchetti documentation, he said. Not a question. I know. You were the one who flagged it to them. Doyle Marchetti flagged it. He filed a complaint with the state medical board 4 months ago. He wanted the record to show that someone had tried to help him. The rest of it followed from there. She paused. I didn't go looking for this, Paulson. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and she wasn't sure why she'd chosen this moment for it. It didn't soften anything, but it changed the tenor slightly. Less formal, more direct. "You could have told me," he said, "after Marchetti. You could have said something to me directly." "I did say something to you directly, that night, about the rhythm pattern." She held his gaze. "You documented it as nursing interference." He looked away first. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no collapse, no admission, no gesture of anything recognizable as remorse. There was just a man in a corridor looking at the floor for a moment before looking up again with his face arranged back into something more controlled. "I was covering myself," he said. The words came out flat, without inflection, like he was reading them off a card. "I'd made the call. I wasn't going to—" He stopped, started again. "I was 25. It was my 3rd month on overnight. And you were right, and I knew you were right, and I documented it the way I did because I didn't want anyone to know that I'd been wrong." She listened to that. "That's honest," she said finally. "The investigators are going to ask you for the same honesty. I'd think carefully about whether you're going to give it to them or whether you're going to make them find it another way, because they will find it either way." She left him there and walked on toward the conference room. The 2 o'clock interview ran 2 hours and 15 minutes. Price led it, Okafor documented, and a third investigator, whose name Evelyn hadn't caught, asked follow-up questions that were specific and well-researched, questions that told her they had already been through more of the hospital's records than anyone in administration had probably anticipated. She presented her documentation, the HR form with the date stamp, the performance review, and her undated draft response. The nursing logs, 3 years of her own parallel documentation, written in the kind of compressed, precise shorthand that came from her military background. The investigators went quiet when she produced those. "You kept independent logs," Price said. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since the Marchetti incident." She paused. "I understood after that what the institutional record was going to look like. I wanted a different record to exist." "Why not take it to the state medical board yourself?" She looked at him steadily. "Because Doyle Marchetti was the one who was harmed. It was his story to tell. I wasn't going to tell it for him." Price looked at her for a long moment. "That's an unusual choice." "It's the right one." He moved on. They covered the performance review timing, the address notification discrepancy. 3 other incidents documented in her personal logs that correlated with physician decisions she had flagged and that had produced adverse or near-adverse patient outcomes. Each incident was cross-referenced to a physician name. Most of them were Graves, 2 were other overnight attendings. At 4:15, Price set down his pen and looked at the documentation spread across the table. "Captain Hart," he said, "I want to be transparent with you about something." She waited. "The investigation that brought us here, the procurement irregularity, the alt connection, that investigation has been running for 8 months. We have been building a case with enough weight that when we move on it, it sticks. Tonight accelerated that timeline. Wool's crash did something that 8 months of document review couldn't fully do. It created a direct, clear human consequence for what was previously a financial and bureaucratic irregularity." He paused. "Your involvement tonight created a second clear human consequence. Because you were here, and because of what you did, and because of who you are, the investigators now have a narrative of this institution that the documents alone could not supply." "I didn't come to work last night to supply anyone's narrative," she said. "I know that." He wasn't disagreeing. "I'm telling you what it means. What happens next is going to move quickly. Within the next 48 to 72 hours, there will be action at multiple levels: hospital administration, the board, the contractor connected to the avionics procurement. I want you to understand that your testimony and these logs are going to be central to what that action looks like." She nodded once. "I also want to ask you something that's outside the formal interview." He glanced at Okafor, who stopped writing. "You've been here 11 years. You had the background to have gone anywhere. Rebuilt a career in military medicine, private sector, academic. Why here?" It was the same question he'd asked before, dressed differently. She thought about giving him the same answer. Then she thought about the 16-year-old from the skiing accident, who had been afraid and alone at 3 in the morning and who had needed someone to explain what was happening to him in a way that made the fear manageable. She thought about Doyle Marchetti's wife, who had sat in the waiting room with her hands folded and her eyes moving to the door every time it opened. Because the work is real, she said. Everything else is institutional. Price sat back. He had the expression of a man who had received an answer he hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with it. He picked up his pen. Okay, let's continue. At 5:47, the interview ended. Evelyn's documentation was formally logged and receipted. She shook hands with Price and Okafor and walked out of conference room 2 into the corridor, which was quieter now than it had been that morning. The first wave of government personnel had left, and the facility had settled into its regular late afternoon tempo, the rhythms of a hospital that was still functioning and still had patients regardless of what was happening in its conference rooms. She was at the elevator when her pager went off. She still carried a pager. The hospital used an app now, but she had kept the pager because it was more reliable in the basement and the parking structure, where connectivity was inconsistent. She looked at the number. ICU, 3rd floor. She took the stairs. The ICU charge nurse met her at the floor entrance, not with alarm, but with something that required an explanation. He's been asking for you, she said, for about 40 minutes. We tried to tell him you weren't assigned to this floor. I know, Evelyn said. She was already moving. Captain Darian Wool was awake, not in the drifting, intermittent way he had been in the early morning, fully awake, his eyes tracking clearly, the brain injury's fog having apparently lifted enough that he was present in a way that was qualitatively different. He was still in significant pain. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the controlled economy of how he moved, and the monitoring apparatus was still doing significant work, but he was there. He saw her come through the door and something in his face shifted. She pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. She didn't speak first. People who were recovering from TBIs needed a moment to organize themselves, and speaking over that moment didn't help. I know who you are, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation and the drugs, but the words were clear. I know you do, she said. I read everything I could find. He paused to manage something, a wave of pain or nausea, or the effort of sustained speech, which wasn't much because most of it was classified. Most of it still is. The framework, he said. The decision tree for high-altitude emergency ejection. I've used it. Every pilot in my program has used it. We use it... Another pause. We use it without knowing who wrote it. That was intentional, she said. Why? She thought about how to answer that. Because credit isn't the point. The protocol working is the point. He looked at her for a long time. He was about 29, she'd read the chart, with the kind of face that suggested he was usually more composed than he currently was, that pain and drugs had eroded a surface that was normally controlled. Underneath was someone who was thinking hard about something. You saved my life twice, he said. Once when you wrote that framework, once last night. The surgical team saved your life last night, she said. I moved some things around. That's not what Colonel Ashford said. Ashford's generous. Wool made a sound that might have been a short laugh and then clearly regretted the movement it required. He waited out the discomfort. I need to tell you something. About the aircraft. She went still. The failure, he said. I knew something was wrong with that system before the flight. I filed a technical concern 3 weeks ago, in writing, through the official channel. The report came back cleared, signed off by the program's safety review contractor. He looked at her steadily. I flew it anyway because it came back cleared and because I trusted the process. I know, she said carefully. The investigators are looking at the contractor. I know they are. I talked to Price this afternoon. He paused. What I haven't told him yet, what I only remembered clearly about 2 hours ago when the TBI fog started lifting, is that the person who brought me the cleared report, the one who handed me the physical paper and told me the concern was resolved. He stopped. She waited. It wasn't someone from the contractor, he said. It was someone from this hospital's board of advisors. I remember the badge. I remember because I thought it was strange. Why would a civilian hospital administrator be at a military flight program facility delivering a safety clearance document? He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. I didn't push on it. I should have. Evelyn sat very still. Do you remember the name on the badge? She asked. He held her gaze. Alt, he said. Clifford Alt. The ICU was very quiet. The monitors traced their rhythms. Outside the window, Silver Ridge was moving into evening, the light going amber over the mountains, ordinary and indifferent. She stood up. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. "I'll get Price," she said. She was at the door when he said her name. Not Evelyn, not Hart, not the title that the morning had restored without ceremony. He said what was on the paperwork that almost no one had ever seen. "Phantom," he said. She stopped with her hand on the door. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back." She didn't turn around. She couldn't have explained exactly why, except that some things landed in places that didn't want an audience, and this was one of them. She stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds. Then she walked out into the corridor, and she was already moving fast, because Price needed to hear what Wohl had just said before Clifford Alt's lawyer, who had reportedly arrived at 4 and was currently in consultation somewhere in this building, had any more time to build the wall that men like Alt always tried to build when the room started closing in. She hit the stairwell at a run. She was on the second-floor landing when her phone buzzed. A text from Okafor. "Call me immediately. Alt's attorney just filed a motion to suppress the procurement documents on national security grounds. We have maybe 2 hours before a federal judge rules on it." She read it once, kept moving, and dialed Price before she'd cleared the stairwell door. He picked up on the first ring. "Wohl remembers," she said. "Alt delivered the safety clearance document personally. He's a direct witness." A silence on the line that lasted less than 3 seconds. "Get him a formal statement," Price said. "Right now, before the sedation schedule changes. I need it signed and witnessed in the next 40 minutes. I'm already going back up." "Hart," he stopped. Then, "Good work." She was already on the stairs. She took the stairs 2 at a time, going back up. The ICU charge nurse looked up when Evelyn came back through the floor entrance, moving faster than nurses usually moved when nothing was actively hemorrhaging. Evelyn didn't stop to explain. She went straight to Wohl's room, pulled the door open, and found Ashford already inside, standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, having apparently arrived through some channel Evelyn hadn't tracked. "You talked to Price," Ashford said. It wasn't a question. "We have 40 minutes to get a signed statement from him before the suppression motion potentially kills the procurement documents." She looked at Wohl, who was watching her with the alert, slightly unfocused attention of someone managing significant pain. "Can you do this right now? Written statement, witnessed, formal. It needs to hold up." "Yes," Wohl said. No hesitation. "Your neurosurgeon isn't here yet. The TBI is still—" "I'm clear," he said. Flat, direct. The voice of someone who had been assessed for cognitive capacity before and knew how to demonstrate it. "Ask me something." She looked at him. "What did you file 3 weeks ago? Through what channel and what came back?" He answered in sequence. The technical concern report number, the filing date, the response turnaround time, the name of the safety review contractor printed on the clearance document. He gave her the detail without prompting and without drift. His eyes were tracking. His speech was organized. "Okay," she said. She went to the nurse's station, got paper, actual paper, because digital documentation had chain of custody complications that Price had specifically mentioned, and came back. "Tell me everything. Start from when you first noticed the anomaly in the system and don't skip anything because it seems minor." He talked. She wrote. Ashford stood at the door and watched the corridor. It took 22 minutes. The statement was 4 pages. Handwritten by Evelyn in her compressed field notation because Wohl's hand wasn't reliable enough with the IV placement, and signed by Wohl at the bottom of each page with a signature that was effortful but legible. Ashford witnessed it. The ICU charge nurse, a woman named Prentice, who had been on this floor for 16 years and who had the expression of someone who understood she was witnessing something significant without knowing its full shape, witnessed it as the second signatory. Evelyn was photographing the pages with her phone, sending them to Price before the ink on the last signature was dry. Price's response came back in under 90 seconds. "Received. Stand by." She stood by. The standby lasted 11 minutes, which she spent at the ICU nurse's station, not looking at her phone with the specific discipline of someone who had learned that watching for a thing didn't make it arrive faster. Ashford came out of Wohl's room and stood beside her. "Alt's attorney is going to argue the statement is compromised," he said. "TBI, medication, cognitive impairment." Wohl answered orientation questions correctly, recalled specific document numbers from 3 weeks ago, and organized a 4-page narrative without prompting or leading. She kept her eyes on the corridor. His neurosurgeon arrives in, she checked, 90 minutes. The attorney can argue whatever he wants. He's arguing against a man who can demonstrate his own clarity. That's a good answer, Ashford said. You should tell Price to have that ready. I already texted it. The phone buzzed. Price. Motion to suppress denied. Federal judge ruled insufficient basis. Procurement documents stand. We're moving tonight. She exhaled once, slowly, through her nose. Then she put the phone in her pocket and looked at the mountain range visible through the ICU window. The last of the evening light going off the peaks, the sky shifting into that particular high-altitude darkness that arrived fast and complete. Tonight, Ashford said, reading something in her posture. Tonight, she confirmed. Set. What moving tonight meant, in practice, was a coordinated action that Evelyn was not part of planning and not invited to observe. What she knew of it came in fragments, from Okafor, who passed through the hospital twice more before 8 in the evening. From Ashford, who received calls she was adjacent to but not included in. From the observable facts of vehicles arriving and departing from the facility's parking lot in configurations that told a story if you knew how to read them. Clifford Alt was taken into federal custody at 7:43 in the evening. She found this out from Okafor's text at 7:51, which read, Alt in custody. His attorney tried to invoke a privilege that doesn't exist for criminal conspiracy. Judge was not impressed. She was in the middle of a patient assessment when the text arrived. A woman in her mid-60s who had come in with elevated blood pressure and dizziness that warranted observation, who had been waiting longer than she should have because the ER was running short-staffed on the evening rotation. Evelyn finished the assessment, adjusted the monitoring order, explained everything to the patient in clear and unhurried terms, and then stepped into the supply corridor and stood by herself for 30 seconds. 7 years, she thought. Wohl had said Alt had been on the board 6 years, but the procurement records Price had shown Doss were dated 7 years ago, which meant Alt had been operating in this capacity, using his position, his access, his administrative credibility, for longer than anyone at Redwood Memorial had apparently questioned. And nobody had questioned it. That was the part that sat in her chest like a cold weight, not because it was surprising, but because it was so entirely predictable and so entirely preventable. And yet here they were, on the other side of a crashed aircraft, and a critical patient, and 11 years of a woman working overnight nursing shifts because the institution had decided she was invisible. And all of it traced back to the same fundamental failure, that the people with authority to ask questions had decided the questions weren't worth asking. She went back to her patient. Harlan Doss was placed on administrative suspension at 8:30. The hospital's board chair, a woman named Aldine Marsh, no relation to the trauma surgeon, who had been on the board for 3 years and who had apparently been as unaware of the procurement irregularity as she was now furious about it, issued the suspension order personally, which was unusual enough that it got noted. The 2 other board members connected to the Alt Financial Network resigned before 9 o'clock, one by phone, one by email, both through attorneys. Evelyn heard about the Doss suspension from the ER charge nurse, who had heard it from someone in administration, who had heard it from the board chair's assistant. That was how institutional information traveled, not in official announcements, but in the lateral movement of people telling other people what they'd just heard. The information degrading slightly at each transfer, but the essential shape of it remaining intact. The essential shape of it was the structure that had organized Redwood Memorial for 9 years had in the space of 20 hours come apart. At 9:15, Graves found her. She was in the medication room, which was not a place staff generally came to have conversations. But Graves had apparently determined that every other location in the facility carried too much risk of audience. He came in, closed the door behind him, and stood against it. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. He also looked like a man who had made a decision and wasn't entirely sure he could carry it through, but was going to try. I called the state medical board's investigative line, he said, an hour ago. She looked at him. I gave them a voluntary statement about the Marchetti incident, about the documentation. He swallowed. About what I did. She was quiet for a moment. Okay. They're going to open a formal review. I'll probably lose my license. Or, I don't know. Maybe not lose it, but it won't be clean. No, she agreed. It won't be. I wanted you to know I did it before they made me. He paused. That's probably cold comfort. It's something, she said. It wasn't generous, but it was accurate. Doyle Marchetti is still going to live the rest of his life the way he lives it now. Your call to the medical board doesn't change that. I know. His voice had lost its texture entirely. He sounded young, which she supposed he was. 26 was young to understand that the cost of protecting yourself from one mistake was a second mistake that compound interested into something much larger. I'm not asking you to... He stopped, started again. I just wanted you to know. She looked at him for a moment, at the wreckage of his certainty, which had been the most prominent thing about him and was now the most absent. You made the call, she said. That counts for something. Not everything, but something. Now go do your job. He nodded, opened the door, and left. She stood in the medication room alone for a moment, then went back to work. At 11 in the evening, Price came to find her himself. This was different from sending Okafor. He came in person, without his investigators, and he found her in the break room where she was eating the first actual meal she'd had since the previous night. A sandwich from the vending machine that was about 60% of what it claimed to be, eaten standing up because sitting down felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make. He sat down at the table. She remained standing. Alt gave a statement, Price said. Partial. His attorney is trying to limit it, but some things came out that we didn't have confirmed before. How partial? Partial enough to be useful and not enough to be complete. He admitted to delivering the clearance document to Wool's program. He's claiming he was acting as an intermediary, that he didn't know the certification was fraudulent, that he was asked to deliver it by the contractor and believed it was legitimate. Price's tone made clear what he thought of this claim. He's also given us 2 additional names, people in the contractor's certification process who signed documents they shouldn't have. Are they in custody? By tomorrow morning. He paused. The aircraft failure killed the component certification trail pretty effectively. There's not much left of the avionics system to examine, but Wool's statement about the document delivery is what closes the chain. It puts Alt in the physical presence of a fraudulent safety certification, delivering it personally to the pilot whose aircraft was built with the compromised component. He looked at her steadily. That statement you got tonight is the linchpin. She finished the sandwich. Good. There's one more thing. He set a folder on the table. This came from the Air Force legal office this afternoon. I've been waiting for the right time to give it to you. She looked at the folder without touching it. Your separation agreement, he said. The administrative hold. The Air Force is initiating a review of the terms. Given the circumstances, your role tonight, Wool's testimony about the framework attribution, and some additional context that has come from Ashford's unit, there's a question being asked about whether the agreement was executed correctly. He paused. There may have been a procedural error in how your record was handled at the time of your separation. What kind of error? The kind that, if confirmed, would mean your official record doesn't reflect your full service accurately, and that certain classifications applied to your record were applied incorrectly. She was very still. Say that plainly. Price opened the folder himself and turned it to face her. Your record, as it currently stands, shows an administrative separation with a general characterization. It should show an honorable discharge with a full commendation file. Someone in the processing chain classified your separation incorrectly and suppressed the commendation record. We don't know yet whether it was error or deliberate, but either way, he paused. The record you've been living under for 11 years isn't the right one. The break room hummed around her. Fluorescent lights, vending machine motor, the distant PA system calling a name somewhere in the hospital. She looked at the documents in the folder. Her own name in official text, the Air Force seal, a date from 11 years ago. Below it, a second document she hadn't seen before, the commendation file that should have been attached to her separation and wasn't, that apparently had been sitting in a classified annex of her record for over a decade without ever being formally connected to anything. She read it. She read it once, slowly, and then she set it down. Who processed my separation? She asked. We're looking into that. That means you have a name. Price's expression didn't change. It means we're looking into it, which I will tell you more about when I can tell you more. He closed the folder and slid it across to her. This copy is yours. The review process has already been initiated. Ashford's unit is sponsoring it. She picked up the folder. It was thin. The physical weight of 11 years of incorrect record was lighter than she would have expected. What happens if the review confirms the error? Your record is corrected. The commendation is formally attached. Your separation is reclassified as honorable with full documentation. He paused. And depending on the administrative hold determination, there may be a question of reinstatement. I'm 51 years old. I'm aware. His voice was neutral. It's still a question that gets asked. You don't have to answer it tonight. She put the folder under her arm. Is there anything else you need from me formally? Not tonight. We'll need you available for follow-up interviews over the next week. I'd ask that you not leave Silver Ridge. I wasn't planning to. She left the break room and walked down the corridor toward the ER. The hospital was in its late-night rhythm, quieter, slower, the night shift fully in control of the building's tempo. She passed two nurses she knew by first name, a security guard she had worked alongside for 8 years, an orderly who nodded without speaking. None of them knew what she was carrying under her arm. None of them knew about the folder, or Wohl's statement, or Alt in custody, or Doss suspended, or the commendation file that had been sitting in a classified annex for 11 years, like a letter no one had ever delivered. She went to the nursing station, signed into the system, and checked the patient board. Bed 12 had come in while she was with Price, an elderly man, fall at home, possible hip fracture, in significant pain and apparently alone. She pulled his chart, noted that he'd been waiting 40 minutes without adequate pain management because the overnight resident hadn't prioritized the order and went to fix it. At 2 in the morning, the hospital was as quiet as it got. Evelyn was at the nursing station finishing documentation when the elevator opened and Ashford walked out. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, which made him look like a different person than the uniformed officer from the previous night, though the way he moved was unchanged. He came to the nursing station. She looked up. Wohl's neurosurgeon completed his assessment an hour ago, Ashford said. TBI is moderate, not severe. Prognosis is good. He'll need time, but he's going to be whole. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. Good. Alt's attorney made a second filing tonight, trying to get the Wohl statement excluded on TBI grounds despite the neurosurgeon's assessment. He sat down in the chair beside the station, which was an informal gesture that somehow registered as significant from a man who operated inside military formality as a default. The judge is reviewing it tomorrow morning. Price doesn't think it'll go anywhere, but Alt has resources, she said, and resources by delay. For a while, he paused. Not forever. She finished the notation she was working on. The nursing station was empty except for them. The other overnight nurse was doing a room check. The resident was somewhere in the building. In the quiet, the hospital sounded like itself. The systems running, the building breathing, the particular constancy of a place that never fully stopped. Can I ask you something? Ashford said. She waited. When you heard the call sign last night, on the frequency, before any of this, he paused, organizing his words. What did it feel like? She thought about it. She thought about the supply corridor and the radio crackling and the specific quality of that phrase coming through the static, two words that had not been spoken in her vicinity for 11 years, that belonged to a part of her life that she had packed away with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who understood that unpacked things had edges. Like a door I thought I'd closed, she said, turning out to not have a lock. Ashford nodded slowly. He looked at the nursing station, the charts, the monitors, the institutional mundanity of the place. 11 years is a long time. It goes fast, she said, which was not quite true and not quite false. It went at the speed it went. Is there something specific you came here to tell me? He looked at her. Price is good at his job. He's going to get what he came for. Alt, the contractor, the certification fraud, probably the processing error on your separation. He'll find it all, and he'll document it thoroughly, and it'll be correct. He paused. But the part I came to tell you is the part that won't be in his report. She waited. Your framework, he said. The decision tree. The ejection protocol. In the last 7 years, it's been used in confirmed critical situations 43 times across 4 branches of the armed services. We didn't publish that number anywhere, but I wanted you to know it. He held her gaze. 43 times. 43 pilots who made decisions in the worst possible circumstances using a structure you built, and most of them walked away. She was quiet. Most, she said. Most, he confirmed. Not everything, not everyone. He didn't dress it. You knew going in it wasn't going to be everyone. Yes, she had known. She had built the framework knowing it would save most and not all, and that most was better than the alternative, and that not all was the cost of working in a domain where the margin between survival and its opposite was measured in fractions. How many didn't walk away? 7. Over 7 years across 4 branches. He held her gaze. I looked it up specifically, before I came here. She processed that number in the way she processed difficult medical information, not suppressing it, not amplifying it, but placing it accurately in its context and sitting with it steadily. 7. 7 people for whom the framework had not been enough, because frameworks were structures and structures didn't eliminate reality. They organized your engagement with it. I think about that, she said finally. Not every day, but regularly. That's probably right, Ashford said. Probably the correct amount. He stood up. He was going back to wherever he'd come from. The military machine that had arrived here for its own reasons, and that would continue turning regardless of what happened in this particular hospital, in this particular Colorado city. Price is going to ask you to testify at a hearing, he said. Federal level, probably in 6 to 8 weeks. He'll give you the formal notice, but I wanted you to hear it from someone who wasn't a lawyer. All right. And he stopped. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before, something that was outside the military register and inside the human one. What you did last night, in this building, it mattered. She looked at him. People get sick here, she said. That's what I told you before. It's still true. I know. He almost smiled. Good night, Captain. He went back to the elevator. She watched it close. Then she turned back to the nursing station and the patient board and the long remaining hours of the shift, and she went back to work. The morning came slowly, as it does at altitude in autumn, the light arriving without warmth before the warmth followed. The 7 o'clock news carried a brief item. Federal investigation into defense contractor Silver Ridge Hospital connected, stripped of specifics and careful enough to indicate that someone with legal authority had spoken to the editorial desk. The full story wasn't there yet. It was coming. By 8 in the morning, staff who had not been present the previous night were arriving and finding the facility changed in ways that were difficult to immediately quantify. Not physically different, but atmospherically, the way a room feels different after the furniture has been rearranged, even if you can't immediately identify what moved. The thing that had moved was authority. The structure by which certain people had held certain power for years was no longer operative, and while the paperwork of that fact was still being processed, the fact itself was present in the building the way cold is present in a room after a window has been opened, felt before it's fully understood. Evelyn handed off to the day shift at 7:52. She wrote her end-of-shift notes with the same thoroughness she always did, gave the oncoming nurse a full verbal handover for each patient, and then collected her bag from her locker. She was at the employee exit when the board chair, Aldine Marsh, appeared from the administrative corridor. She was a tall woman in her 50s, angular and direct, who appeared to have slept approximately as well as Evelyn had. Ms. Hart, she said. Evelyn stopped. I've been briefed, Marsh said, by Price's team, by Colonel Ashford, and by Dr. Renata Marsh independently. She paused. Not related for the record. Dr. Marsh and I have been over this. Despite everything, something almost broke through Evelyn's face at that. Noted. I want to be direct with you. The board chair's voice was steady. What happened in this facility? The performance review, the documentation discrepancy, the address notification issue. Those were not isolated failures. They were the result of a culture that I did not sufficiently interrogate. That's on me as well as on the people directly involved. She paused. I'm not asking for anything in return for saying that. I'm saying it because it's accurate. Evelyn looked at her. The board chair wasn't performing contrition. She was doing something harder, which was standing in accountability without softening it. It was more than Evelyn had expected, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. I appreciate that, she said. I'd like to ask you to come back. Marsh's voice was even. To continue working here, and I'd like to discuss what that looks like in terms of your role going forward. Not today, when you've slept. A pause. If you want to come back. Evelyn considered the question. She considered the 16-year-old from the skiing accident and the elderly woman with the UTI that had gone systemic, and Doyle Marchetti's wife in the waiting room, and the man in bed 12 who'd been in pain for 40 minutes before she'd fixed it. She considered the folder under her arm with its 11-year-old documents, and the 2 words on the emergency frequency that had turned out to not be a door closing, but a door opening, and the question of what you did with an open door. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "We can talk after my shift." Marsh nodded. She didn't oversell it. She moved aside, and Evelyn walked through the employee exit into the cold Colorado morning. The air outside was sharp and clean, the way high-altitude air was in autumn, thin, requiring something from your lungs, honest about what it was. She stood for a moment in the parking lot. Her truck was where she'd left it. The mountains were where they always were. The hospital behind her was still running, still full of people who needed things, and staff trying to provide them, the machinery of care continuing regardless of everything else. She put her bag in the truck, put the folder on the passenger seat, and started the drive home. She was 20 minutes outside Silver Ridge, on the road into the foothills, when her phone rang. Unknown number, federal prefix. She pulled over and answered. Captain Hart. Not Price. Not Okafor. A different voice, older, more formal, carrying the specific register of someone who spent their days in rooms where significant things were decided. "My name is Hargrove. I'm with the Secretary of the Air Force's office, Inspector General Division. I apologize for the hour." "It's all right," she said. "We've been reviewing the documentation related to your separation, specifically the commendation file and the record classification." A pause that was not hesitation but wait. "We found the processing error. It was not accidental." She gripped the phone. "The classification on your separation record was deliberately applied," Hargrove said. "We have located the individual responsible. It connects to the same procurement network that the current investigation has been tracing." He paused. "Your record was suppressed because someone in the processing chain was concerned that your commendation file, which contained detailed attribution for the framework protocols, would make it difficult to reassign credit for those protocols to a research contractor that was at that time in the process of bidding on a military training contract." She sat in the truck on the side of the road with the mountains visible through the windshield and the phone against her ear. "Someone buried my record," she said, "so they could claim my work." "That is what the documentation indicates, yes." His voice was careful. "The contractor subsequently won the training contract. The protocols were incorporated into their proprietary training materials. They have received federal payments totaling," a pause, presumably consulting a figure, $11.4 million over 6 years for training programs built on methodology that is documented in your commendation file as your original work. The morning was very quiet. Wind moved in the trees above the road. "That contractor," she said slowly, "is it connected to the avionics procurement, the component that failed on Wool's aircraft?" A pause that lasted too long. "Captain Hart," Hargrove said, "I think we need to bring you in for a formal briefing." "I'll be there," she said. "Tell me when and where." Hargrove gave her the details. A federal building in Denver, 2 days out, 8 in the morning. She wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. She thanked him, ended the call, and sat in the truck on the side of the road with the phone in her lap and the mountains in front of her, and the specific silence of a moment when everything you thought you understood about a situation turns out to have been the surface of something much deeper. $11.4 million. 6 years of federal contracts. Training programs sold back to the military built on work that was hers, attributed to a contractor that had buried her record to clear the path. And that same contractor, she didn't have confirmation yet, but the pause in Hargrove's voice had been long enough and specific enough that she didn't need it spelled out. Connected to the avionics procurement. Connected to the component that failed. Connected to a 29-year-old pilot who had almost died in a field in Colorado because someone had decided that the cost of cutting corners was acceptable as long as the paperwork held. She sat with that for a while. Not long, she was too tired for extended stillness, and the road home was still in front of her, but long enough to understand what she was looking at. Then she started the truck and drove. She slept for 6 hours, which was not enough, and was what she had. She woke to 3 missed calls: Price, Okafor, Ashford, and a text from Hargrove's office confirming the Denver meeting with a case reference number attached. She made coffee that she actually drank this time, standing at the kitchen window while the hills outside moved in the morning wind. She called Price first. "Hargrove called me last night," she said when he picked up. A short pause. "I know. I asked him to. I wanted you to have the full picture from someone with the right clearance level before we brought you in for the formal briefing." His voice had something in it that wasn't quite an apology, but was adjacent to one. "The contractor connection. We confirmed it at about 1 in the morning. Meridian Defense Solutions. They hold the training contract and they hold a secondary contract through a subsidiary for avionics component certification on experimental aircraft programs. The same subsidiary that certified the component that failed on Wool's aircraft," she said. "Yes." She drank her coffee. So Alt wasn't just delivering a fraudulent clearance document. He was protecting a business relationship that ran through the board. 2 board members held positions on Meridian's advisory council. Alt was the operational connector, the person who made sure the hospital's institutional credibility was available to Meridian when they needed it for contract purposes. Price's voice was flat, with the particular flatness of someone delivering information they find genuinely appalling, but have disciplined themselves not to editorialize. Hospitals carry a specific kind of legitimacy: medical board connections, safety certification familiarity, professional credibility, and federal review processes. Meridian used Redwood Memorial's institutional standing as a reference layer for their defense contracts. And in exchange, she said, Alt and the board members received what? Advisory fees routed through the subsidiary. We're still documenting the full amount, but preliminary review suggests it's in the range of $2.3 million over 5 years across the 3 individuals. She set down her coffee cup. "And my record?" "Your record was suppressed at the request of Meridian's then CEO. We have the communication. It was internal, between a Meridian executive and an Air Force processing official who had a consulting relationship with the company. The official falsified your separation classification and withheld the commendation file. He retired from the Air Force 2 years after doing it and went to work for a Meridian subsidiary." Price paused. "He's been located. He's cooperating." The morning outside was clear and cold. A hawk was working the thermals above the ridge, patient and unhurried, doing the thing it did because it was the thing it did. "They buried my record so they could sell my work," she said. It came out even. She had processed most of the anger in the truck the previous night, somewhere between the foothills and the highway, and what remained was a cleaner and more durable thing. "And then they used the money from selling my work to fund the operation that nearly killed the pilot who was flying on the protocols I built." "That's the shape of it," Price said quietly. She breathed. "All right, I'll be in Denver on Thursday. I'll make sure the right people are in the room." She ended the call and stood at the window for another minute. Then she got dressed and drove back to Silver Ridge. The formal briefing in Denver took place in a federal building conference room that was better appointed than Redwood Memorial's and significantly less honest in its atmosphere, the kind of room where important things were decided in language that had been sanded until it no longer cut. Evelyn sat on one side of the table. On the other, Hargrove, 2 attorneys from the JAG office, a representative from the Secretary of the Air Force's office, whose name she didn't catch and didn't need, and Price, who was there in a capacity that crossed jurisdictions, and who sat at the end of the table with the particular stillness of a man watching a process he had helped build arrive at its conclusion. The briefing covered the full scope: Meridian Defense Solutions, the training contract, the attribution fraud, the avionics subsidiary, the certification falsification, the payment structure, the advisory fees, the board connection, the record suppression. All of it laid out in the organized, sequential language of official accountability, each piece cross-referenced and sourced and documented in ways that meant none of it could be argued into a different shape. She listened to all of it. She asked 3 questions, each specific and each answered directly. She signed 4 documents: acknowledgments, consent forms, a formal victim statement in the attribution fraud case that she was told would be part of the federal filing. She did not perform a motion for the room. She did not require anyone in the room to manage her response to what she was hearing. She sat and listened and processed and asked what she needed to ask. At the end of the briefing, the JAG representative, a colonel named Ferris, who had the air of someone who had delivered a great deal of information in her career and was accustomed to people's reactions varying, slid a document across the table. Your separation record has been formally corrected, Ferris said. As of this morning, the classification has been reclassified as honorable discharge with full commendation. The commendation file has been attached and is now part of your official permanent record. She paused. The citation within it has been updated to include formal attribution of the ejection decision framework under your name, Captain Evelyn Hart. The update will be communicated to all branches currently using the protocol. Evelyn looked at the document. Her name was on it, and below her name was the description of the framework. Precise, technical, the language of people who understood what they were reading. And below that, the commendation language, which was formal and restrained in the military way, but which contained, beneath the official register, the accumulated weight of work she had done in the years before Silver Ridge. Work she had done because it needed doing, and because she could do it well, and because the alternative was to leave problems unsolved that didn't need to be unsolved. She picked up the pen they had placed beside the document. She signed where she was directed. She did not allow her hand to be anything other than steady. "There's one additional matter," Ferris said. "The administrative hold on your commission. Given the circumstances of your separation, the deliberate misclassification, the fraudulent suppression, the Air Force is prepared to formally lift the hold." A pause. "This would make you eligible for reinstatement if you chose to pursue it. We're not suggesting that you should. We're saying that the option exists and that it exists cleanly, without condition." Evelyn looked at her. "I'm 51 years old." "Yes. Reinstatement at my age and my commission would be primarily ceremonial." "Not necessarily. There are advisory and training capacities that—" Ferris stopped herself. "We're not recruiting you. We're restoring your options. What you do with them is your decision." Evelyn looked at the document again, at the corrected record, at her name attached to work she had done, and that had mattered in ways she was only now being allowed to fully understand. At the number Ashford had given her, 43 pilots, 43 critical situations, 43 moments when the structure she had built had been the thing that organized someone's decision-making in the worst possible circumstances. "I'll think about it," she said, which was honest. Meridian Defense Solutions was formally charged on a Friday morning, 6 days after Wool's crash. The charges were federal: fraud, falsification of safety certifications, conspiracy to defraud the Department of Defense, and 3 counts relating to the attribution and contract fraud. The company's CEO, a man named Brant Kohler, who had been with the organization for 9 of its 12 years, was taken into custody at his home in Virginia at 6 in the morning and made no statement. His attorney made several, none of which altered anything. The 2 Redwood Memorial Board members connected to Meridian's advisory council resigned the same day the charges were filed, which was not coincidental. Their attorneys had been in communication with the prosecutors, and the timing of the resignation was a negotiated piece of a cooperation agreement that bought them a somewhat smaller set of charges than they would otherwise have faced. It did not buy them enough. By the following week, both were facing criminal charges of their own, stripped of the board positions and the advisory fees and the institutional credibility that had made them useful to Meridian in the first place. Clifford Alt did not cooperate. His attorney fought every piece of evidence, filed motions on every available legal basis, and delivered statements to the press that characterized the investigation as a politically motivated overreach targeting a respected community leader. The press, having by that point access to the full documented record, was not receptive. Alt was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction. The obstruction charge stemming from his attempt to suppress Wool's witness statement through the motion his attorney had filed the night of the crash. The irony that the suppression attempt had drawn additional attention to exactly the statement he was trying to suppress was noted by no one officially and by everyone practically. Harlan Doss reached a settlement with the state medical board that included a formal censure, a 2-year supervision requirement, and a permanent notation in his professional record. He did not face criminal charges because the documentation of his direct involvement in the Meridian financial arrangement was insufficient for criminal prosecution. He had been used without being fully informed, which his attorney argued and the prosecutors ultimately credited to a degree. What he did face was the end of his tenure at Redwood Memorial, the erosion of the professional reputation he had spent 9 years constructing, and the specific public record of what his administration had allowed to happen in the facility under his control. Paulson Graves faced the state medical board review he had anticipated. His voluntary statement, combined with the Marchetti documentation and Evelyn's independent nursing logs, produced a formal finding of inadequate clinical response and improper documentation. His license was placed on provisional status for 18 months, with mandatory supervision and a clinical remediation program. He would practice again, eventually, under conditions that would remind him for years of the cost of protecting himself at someone else's expense. It was not a clean outcome for him. It was not supposed to be. Doyle Marchetti was contacted by the State Medical Board's Victim Services Office in the third week after the investigation became public. He was offered formal acknowledgement of the finding, a letter for his medical record, and access to a review process for any additional remediation. He accepted all of it. He came to the hospital once more, not as a patient. He had transferred his care, which was entirely understandable, but to speak with Evelyn directly. She met him in the lobby. I was moving more slowly than she remembered, with a cane now, his left hand curled slightly inward in the way it had been since the cardiac event. His wife was with him, a small woman with dark eyes who held his arm with the particular attention of someone who had learned not to take presence for granted. "I heard what happened," he said. "With the military. All of it." "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something." He looked at her directly. "That night, last November, when you flagged the concern and they sent you back, did you know for certain what was going to happen?" She thought about the honest answer. "I knew it was likely. I wasn't certain." "But you flagged it anyway." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He was working through something, the particular accounting that people did when they were trying to understand what they owed to what had happened to them and what they owed to the person who had tried to prevent it. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, "for trying, even when it didn't—" He paused. "Even when it didn't work out." "I'm sorry it didn't work out," she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. She said it anyway because it was true, and because the truth, even when it was insufficient, was better than the alternative. He nodded again. His wife looked at Evelyn for a long moment with the expression of someone who had formed an opinion and was letting it be seen. Then they left, slowly, back through the lobby doors into the pale Colorado afternoon. Evelyn stood in the lobby for a while after they'd gone. But 3 weeks after the crash, Redwood Memorial held a staff meeting. Not the administrative kind, not a departmental briefing or a policy update. An all-staff meeting in the main conference space, called by the board chair Aldine Marsh, who stood at the front of the room without a prepared statement and spoke for 20 minutes about what had happened in this building and what it meant, and what the board intended to do about it. She named Evelyn Hart by name. She described the performance review, the address notification discrepancy, the 11 years of dismissed escalations, the independent nursing logs. She described the night of Wool's crash and what Evelyn had done in those hours. She described the classified record and the corrected separation and what the commendation file contained. She described it all without softening it or reframing it or placing institutional reputation above the factual account of how an institution had behaved. The room was very quiet throughout. When she finished, she looked across the assembled staff, nurses, physicians, residents, administrative staff, technicians, the full body of people who made the building run, and she said, "We cannot go back and make different decisions for the people who made the wrong ones. What we can do is understand clearly how those decisions were possible and change what allowed them to be made." Evelyn sat in the third row. She had not been told she would be named. She had not been given a script or a prepared response. When the room looked at her, which it did, the assembled attention of several hundred people shifting in her direction, she did not stand, did not perform anything, did not give the gathering what it might have wanted in the way of visible emotion or dramatic moment. She sat, and she met the attention steadily, and after a moment the meeting continued. The conversation with Aldine Marsh happened 2 days later, in the board chair's temporary office. Doss's former space had been reassigned pending the formal search for a new medical director. Marsh sat across from her at a desk that still had a few of Doss's framed credentials in a corner, not yet removed. "I want to offer you a formal role," Marsh said, "not as a floor nurse. Clinical standards coordinator, with direct reporting to the incoming medical director and a seat on the patient safety committee. The position includes authority to flag and escalate clinical concerns across departments, documentation that cannot be overridden without board-level review, and compensation adjusted to reflect the actual scope of the role." Evelyn looked at her. That's a significant structural change. Yes, it is. Marsh didn't apologize for it. We should have had it years ago. We're having it now. I want two things, Evelyn said. Tell me. The nursing logs I kept, my independent documentation, I want them formally integrated into the facility's incident review record. Not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as a methodology. A model for how clinical concerns should be tracked when the official system fails to capture them. Marsh nodded. Done. What's the second? The young nurses on the overnight rotation. I want a formal mentorship structure. Not a program. Programs get administered and then they stop. A structure built into the scheduling, with documentation, that means the most junior staff have access to experienced clinical oversight on every shift. She paused. The people who get hurt by institutions like the one this facility was are often the people who are too new to know how to protect themselves or their patients. That changes. Marsh held her gaze for a moment. Done, she said again. They shook hands. It wasn't a warm moment. It wasn't supposed to be. It was two people establishing terms, which was honest and which was enough. Captain Darian Wool was discharged from Redwood Memorial 41 days after the crash. He walked out under his own power, which he had been told 4 weeks earlier might not be possible, and which he had consequently decided to make his primary project. His left leg carried a slight hitch in its movement that his physical therapist said would likely remain and that Wool carried without visible concession. He came to find Evelyn before he left. She was in the middle of a training session, one of the first under the new mentorship structure. 3 junior nurses gathered around a monitoring station while she walked them through the specific indicators she had been trying to explain to people for 11 years in the informal, unrecorded, unreceived way that unofficial knowledge moved through institutions. She saw him come through the door and held up one finger, a gesture that said, "Wait without saying stop," and finished the point she was making before she excused herself. He was in the corridor when she came out, in civilian clothes, with a go bag on his shoulder, looking like a person on their way somewhere rather than a person who had recently had 3 separate surgical interventions and a TBI that had been described as moderate to severe before the neurosurgeon downgraded it. "You look better," she said. "I feel about 60% of better," he said, "which I'm told is ahead of schedule." "It is." He looked at her for a moment. She could see him organizing something, the thing he had come to say, which was apparently resisting the form he wanted it to take. She waited. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her, "in the ICU. When I said you'd saved my life twice, you pushed back on it. The surgical team, I know what you said. I wasn't dismissing it. I've been thinking about why you said it, and I think—" He paused. "I think you push back because you've been doing this work for so long in a place where no one acknowledged it, that you've trained yourself not to need the acknowledgement, because needing it and not getting it is worse than not needing it." She was quiet. "I think that's a survival strategy," he said, "and I think it worked, and I think it cost you something." She looked at him. "That's a significant amount of thinking for someone who's supposed to be resting." "I had 41 days. He almost smiled. "Phantom. Evelyn. I'm going to say this, and I need you to just hear it. You brought me home. Not the surgical team, not the drugs, not the equipment. You made the decisions at the moment when the decisions had to be made, and you were right, and I'm standing here because of that. And the 43 pilots, or however many it is now, who made it through the worst moments of their careers using the framework you built, they came home because of you too." He looked at her directly. "You don't have to push that back. You're allowed to keep it." She stood in the corridor of the hospital she had worked in for 11 years, with its worn floors and its fluorescent lights, and its ordinary human machinery of care and failure and occasional grace, and she let the words arrive and stay where they landed without redirecting them. "Thank you," she said. He stood at attention. The movement was careful, the left leg, the lingering effects of everything. But it was precise, and it was deliberate, and it was the same salute she had received weeks ago that had rearranged the understanding of everyone in the room. She didn't deflect it this time. She let him hold it for a moment. Then she said quietly, "At ease, Captain." He dropped the salute, picked up his bag, and walked to the elevator. She watched it close. Then she went back to the monitoring station where 3 junior nurses were waiting, and she returned to the work. The federal trial for Brandt Kohler and the Meridian principals began 8 months later. It ran for 6 weeks. The evidence was comprehensive. The documentation that Price's team had assembled, Wool's witness statement, the communication records showing the deliberate suppression of Evelyn's separation record, the payment structures, the certification falsifications, the full chain of decisions that had placed profit above safety and called the result paperwork. Evelyn testified for 2 days. She answered questions from the prosecution and the defense with the same steadiness she brought to everything, precise, factual, unflinching in the face of the defense's attempt to characterize her as a disgruntled former employee with an institutional grievance rather than a witness to documented fraud. The attempt did not land well. She was not disgruntled. She was composed and specific and correct, and the jury, who were ordinary people paying attention to an extraordinary account, could see the difference. Kohler was convicted on 7 of 9 counts. The Meridian subsidiary principals received convictions on various charges. The Air Force official who had falsified her separation record, the one who had retired into a Meridian consulting position 2 years after suppressing her commendation file, pleaded guilty to fraud and falsification of official records and received a sentence that included prison time and the formal revocation of his retirement benefits. Clifford Alt was convicted on all 3 counts he faced. His attorney's arguments, which had been extensive and expensive and technically sophisticated, met the documented record and lost. He was sentenced to 4 years, which would be served in a federal facility, at the end of which he would emerge into a world that had formally and publicly recorded what he had done in it. On the day the verdicts were announced, Evelyn was in the hospital. She was not watching the news. She heard about it from Okafor, who texted her a single line, "All counts, across the board." She read the text in the supply corridor, the same corridor where she had stood on the night of the crash, and heard a radio frequency say 2 words that had changed everything. She stood there for a moment, then she put her phone in her pocket and went to check on her patients. The thing about justice is that it rarely arrives in the form you imagined when you were waiting for it. You expect something transformative, a moment when the weight you've been carrying lifts cleanly and completely, and the world reassembles itself into the shape it should always have had. What actually happens is smaller and stranger and more human than that. What happened for Evelyn was this. She drove home on an ordinary Tuesday evening in autumn, the mountains going dark against a sky that was moving from gold to blue, and she turned on the radio and found a station playing something instrumental, spare, unhurried. And she drove the 12 miles to her house in the foothills, and she thought about the work that was in front of her tomorrow. The junior nurses, the morning protocol review, the patient in bed 7 who had been improving in ways that the documentation would need to capture accurately, the monitoring structure that she and the incoming medical director, a woman named Dr. Kwan who had come from a teaching hospital in Oregon and who had asked Evelyn in their first meeting to tell her what was actually wrong with the facility, a question to which Evelyn had given a thorough and honest answer, had been building together over the past 2 months. She thought about Doyle Marchetti's left hand. She thought about it the way she thought about the 7 pilots, not in a way that produced prolonged pain, but with the regular and accurate attention that the fact deserved. It had happened. The consequences of it were ongoing. The accounting of it had been made as fully as an accounting could be made. That was the honest shape of the outcome, and she had made her peace with honest shapes. She parked outside her house. The hills above were already dark. The wind had come up, moving through the trees in that specific autumn way that sounded like something beginning rather than something ending. She stayed in the truck for a minute, which was something she almost never did. She was not a person who sat still without purpose. But she sat, and she let the day settle around her, and she thought about a call sign that had traveled across an emergency frequency in the middle of the night and landed in the supply corridor of a hospital where a woman in worn-out scrubs had looked up from a chart and recognized something she had believed she'd left behind. She had not left it behind. It had been inside the work the whole time, inside every escalation she'd filed and every patient she'd assessed and every junior nurse she'd stayed late to walk through a complicated case. The call sign and the nursing badge were not different things that had collided unexpectedly. They were the same thing, expressed in different languages, in service of the same fundamental orientation toward the world. That the work in front of you is real, and the people in your care are real, and you bring everything you have to both of those facts without reservation and without waiting for permission. She had never needed permission. She had needed for a while for the record to catch up to the truth. It had caught up now. She got out of the truck. The air was cold and sharp and honest about what it was. She walked to the door of her house and she opened it, and she went inside to whatever came next. 6 months after the crash, a new plaque was mounted on the wall of the Redwood Memorial Nursing Education Center, a room that had not previously existed, that had been converted from a storage space in a renovation that the board had approved in the weeks following the investigation. The center was small and practical, outfitted with the monitoring equipment and the reference materials that the nursing mentorship program required. It was not elegant. It was functional, which was better. The plaque was not a memorial. It was not a tribute. It was a statement of institutional record, the kind of language that official plaques used when they were trying to say something true rather than something flattering. It read, Clinical Standards and Training Center, established in acknowledgement that the quality of care delivered in this facility depends on the knowledge and authority of every person providing it, regardless of title. Evelyn had not written it. She had been shown it before installation and asked whether the language was accurate. She had said yes. She walked past it every morning when she came in for her shift. Sometimes she noticed it, and sometimes she didn't, the way you stop noticing the things that become part of where you work. But on the mornings when she did notice it, she thought about what it had taken to put those words on that wall. Not the renovation budget, not the board vote, but the longer history underneath both of those things. The history of someone staying at a post that didn't want her, doing work that didn't credit her, keeping her own record in a file drawer at home because she understood that the official record was not reliable, and that someone had to keep the accurate one. The accurate record now existed. In the federal archives and the Air Force personnel files and the court documents and the facility's formal institutional history, the record existed. It said what had happened, and who had done what, and what it had cost, and who had been right. It said her name correctly. She went to work. In the training room, 3 nurses were waiting, 2 in their first year, 1 finishing her second, all of them at the stage in their careers when the gap between what they'd been taught and what they were encountering in actual practice had started to show itself, when the confidence of training was meeting the complexity of real patients and finding that confidence alone was not sufficient. Evelyn set her bag down and looked at them. She thought about what she had needed at their stage. Not reassurance, not praise, but the specific grounded knowledge of someone who had already made the mistakes and understood what they cost. Let's start with the monitoring protocol, she said. Not the way it's written in the handbook, the way it actually works, and what the handbook doesn't tell you, and what to do when the two don't match. One of the nurses, a young woman named Tara, first year, sharp-eyed and careful, the kind of person who would ask the right question at the right moment if the right moment was given to her, leaned forward slightly. Happens a lot? She asked. More than you'll expect, Evelyn said. Less than it should. That gap is what we're going to work on. She pulled up the monitoring system and began. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood where they always stood. Indifferent, permanent, unchanged by the machinery of human accountability happening at their feet. The hospital ran. The building breathed. The work continued as it always had and would, patient by patient, shift by shift, in the hands of whoever was present and willing to bring everything they had to the task in front of them. That was in the end, the whole of it. Not the title, or the commendation, or the corrected record, or the vindication that had come slowly and imperfectly, and later than it should have. Those things mattered. She did not pretend they didn't, not anymore, but they were not the architecture. They were the acknowledgement that the architecture had been there all along, doing its work, waiting for the record to arrive. The architecture was the work itself. It always had been. And if you are someone who has been dismissed, reduced, written off by people who mistook your silence for absence and your patience for weakness, understand this. The work you do in the spaces where no one is watching is not lost. It accumulates. It builds. It becomes the structure that other people stand on without knowing your name, and the day will come, in one form or another, when the record catches up to the truth of what you built. You do not have to wait for permission to be what you already are. You never did.